Hey everybody, Cybertal with you. We're continuing our review of hanging pawns. We're getting into more traditional methods of using hanging pawns as an attacking device. We've got a nice little attacking fireworks display to look at today. This is Garry Kasparov against Portisch from 1983. This is just before Kasparov played for the World Championship for the first time in 1984, but even then he was probably the strongest player in the world. He'd probably objectively already surpassed Karpov in strength. At this point, he was very well known for his attacking prowess, and this was a gorgeous display from him. Kasparov is white. d4. Just a quick aside, Kasparov, as far as I know, was really the first player to be known for his attacking prowess while playing 1d4. 1e4 had always been known for being the aggressive attacking opening, and d4 was sort of pigeonholed as the more positional opening. Kasparov took a lot of lines from his teachers like Petrosian and just supercharged them with a lot of aggressive attacking intents. Really, definitely the first great attacking player to serve from both sides comfortably, both e4 and d4 certainly. He was sort of the first truly modern player. Now every modern grandmaster is expected to play one d4 and one e4 with equal skill. d4 from Kasparov, f3. In 1983, this was the time when avoiding the Nimzo Indian was considered fairly essential. There were so many lines of the Nimzo at that point that were doing very well for black that it was just thought that heading into for a Queen's Indian or a delayed Queen's Gambit decline with d5 was considered much better for white. Now you see knight c3, knight f3 in equal measure. But just a matter of taste these days. But Kasparov played knight f3. b6, that heads into the Queen's Indian. Bishop b4, that would be the Bogo Indian. That's part of my repertoire. It's a fairly solid opening from black. And then, of course, d5 would head into the Queen's Gambit. Black can claim that he's gained something by forcing white to move his knight to f3. That eliminates some lines of the exchange Queen's Gambit declines, but it's really just a matter of taste. But b6 heads in the Queen's Gambit. Knight c3, this is a little bit of a... It's perfectly fine, it's theory, but it's a little bit of a controversial choice. If Kasparov wanted to play the Petrosian, it's more flexible to play a3 here, which he does one move later. Here, this allows bishop b4, which is still theory. This is still perfectly fine for white. But this is sort of a nameless Queen's Indian Nimzo hybrid that can be incredibly sharp and has quite a bit of theory attached to it. If white wanted to restrict black's possibilities, a3 would be a little bit more restricted at this point. But Portisch was a bit more of a positional player. Bishop b4 can lead to very irrational positions, so Portisch played bishop b7, and then a3. This is the Petrosian variation. So by preventing bishop b4, white enhances his control over e4, because there's no way this knight can be pinned now, so his control over e4 is a little bit stronger. That's really the main point of the Petrosian variation. Best move from black. There's a couple of other options, but they're considered fairly minor. d5 is the best move here, clearly. Because a3 prevents bishop e4, black needs to fight for the e4 square manually, or else white's just going to get a large center and start beating black to death. cd, knight takes, bishop e7, bishop e5 check. This is just a little modern nicety that doesn't amount to a whole lot. White encourages c6 first and then drops his bishop back to d3. But black is more than likely going to play c5 anyway, so it doesn't really amount to all that much. Castle, bishop e2. This is a major choice from white here. So the bishop on b2 obviously isn't terribly happy. It's biting on the ground of both those pawns. This bishop move is played with the assumption that either c4 or e4 will be played. And then it's up to white which of those that he plays, of course, and that is a huge change in structure based on that choice. e4 is more of the classical move, and this would be another way of deploying the bishop on the dark square bishop, just putting on e3 to defend the d4 pawn. White really doesn't get much from these positions, though. One of the real revolutions in modern theory after the hypermodern revolution, it was always said by the hypermoderns that you had to attack this pawn center quickly to tear it down, or else you would get choked to death. one of the real revolutions in modern theory was realizing if you play correctly, you're not necessarily getting suffocated by this center. A pawn center is really only an asset if it's taking squares away from the enemy's pieces. Here, all the black's pieces are quite comfortable. This knight can hop to a5, or it can look at the c4 square. That's a perfectly good route for it to take. Black is fine here. One of the real revolutions in modern theory is realizing this pawn duo doesn't even need to be attacked all that quickly. That black can just play around it, Grunfeld style. But bishop e2, I personally prefer this just because it leaves more flexibility in the position. Rook c8. One thing I always tell my students, when you're choosing between several different moves, figure out which moves are 100% essential to your position. Here, rook c8, it's probably going to be in most positions, but we're not entirely sure. We know for a fact that castling is going to be in every position. So black should start with castling, because he knows he's going to play that. So get the move you know you're going to play out of the way first, and then determine your structure, other pieces later. One option, I would leave the rook on a8 for now, because after queen c7, the rook might be better on d8. Who knows? But right now, black is just determining the best pieces for his minor pieces. This knight on a5, again, we like to laugh at Dr. Tarash. He came up with the starter phrases that we all learned from, but a knight on the rim isn't grim all that often. Sometimes it is. But here, the knight on a5 makes perfect sense. It aims at the c4 square. That can eventually be an outpost for that knight. It aims at the b3 square, where it can hop into and be fairly strong. This is just a complex position with equal chances. The fact that white owns the center isn't really crimping black's style at all. So rook c8, it's not bad, but we don't know if the rook belongs in c8 yet, so it could end up being a quasi-wasted move. Queen e2, castle, rook e1. So, in opposition to this move, we know for a fact the best squares for the white rooks. So, this is an attacking position for white. White has a lot of his pieces aimed at the king side, so trading pieces off doesn't really interest him. He wants to keep his attacking forces on the board and go for pressure. So the c-file doesn't really interest white, because that's just going to be a venue for black trading off rooks. These bishops on d3 and b2 control all the penetration squares in the c-file. So even if black organizes some of his rooks in the c-file, it's hard for black to make anything of that c-file. So there's no reason to play a move like rook ac1, because there's just no reason to challenge for the file. The file doesn't do anything for black yet. The clear places for the rooks are d1 and e1. Because eventually, white's going to be playing for that d5 break, just like in most hanging pawns positions. And both those rooks will be blown wide open, and their activity instantly enhanced by that pawn break. So, rook e1, perfectly good move. c4. So, this is the most interesting choice. This would personally be my choice. e4 is the classical approach, but it's also the less aggressive approach, because look how it blunts off the bishop on d3, so suddenly white has less attacking firepower with that bishop. The bishop on b2 is still completely blunted off, so it has no influence over the king side whatsoever. You instantly compare the move c4. The bishop, one less pawn in its way, so its power towards the king side is enhanced. The bishop on d3 isn't blunted off by that move, so it's still firing and ready to go. c4 is the much more aggressive approach, whereas e4 is the positional approach, but again, this pawn center doesn't hamper black. Say knight a5, this is the classical move against this pawn duo. And then bishop c6. So bishop c6 is a very flexible move. It's planning bishop a4, where it can sort of lock down this outpost on b3. Perhaps play queen b7, where you've got a nice battery on this diagonal suddenly. And look at both of these white bishops. They just don't have any influence over the king side. This is just an equal position. This pawn center looks nice, but it doesn't matter what something looks like, it matters what it does. And right now this pawn center isn't doing anything for whites. c4 starts unlocking the potential of white's pieces, which is what he wants to be doing. He wants to be going for kingside pressure. So c4, absolutely the correct choice in my opinion. It leads to hanging pawns, but again, those aren't a weakness always. Here they're completely active. cx d4. So this is a really bad time to go for hanging pawns. This unleashes white's activity completely. Knight a5 is necessary. So c4 did create a target on c4 that knight a5 can suddenly aim at. Plus, it's activating this bishop on b7. This is completely necessary. d5, this is completely consistent. White wants to rip open the position. It doesn't matter if it's a pawn sacrifice or not. I give some analysis in the game notes that I encourage you to look at. I don't want to make the video too long as usual, but the main line that I gave, I would say bishop takes on d5 is best. This wins the exchange, but black actually has quite decent compensation here. But this is certainly better for white. White is the only one setting the pace here, but black does have counterplay, because this bishop on d5 is quite strong, plus this passed c-pawn can be quite strong. But the consistency of what black is looking for is he doesn't want to open the position up. He wants to try to stifle white's attacking ambitions by reducing the scope of white's pieces. cx d4 does exactly the opposite. It's opening the position up. It's opening these bishops up. It's opening that d file for the rook. When you're in a position where you're defending, and black is certainly defending this position because of all the things aimed at his kingside already, you want to look for ways to blunt your opponent's attacking pieces. This is just opening things up for them. Knight a5, and then the move that whenever you have hanging pawns should be the very first move you look at. d5. In virtually any position, you want to look at your pawn breaks immediately. The pawn breaks, just to review, a pawn break is where you bring your pawn into attacking distance from your opponent's pawn with the idea of opening the position up. So white's trying to break things open with this move of d5. And it can be a pawn sacrifice. In this exact position, it's not. But always look to your pawn breaks. Always look to those, because those are the main devices for activating your pieces and changing the structure of the position. Here, d5 is completely decisive, and this is the move you always want to be looking at when you're playing with hanging pawns. ex d5, this is natural, but this is basically losing. Knight x c4 had to be played. The following line is long, but basically all forced. Forces g6, forces f6, forces queen a6, forces b5, and bishop b5 is not forced, but it's the best move. So black is just barely holding on here. This is positionally winning for white for sure, because white's not even down material here, and white has a completely winning positional edge here. But black is still forcing white to find the moves. Again, ex d5. Try to keep the position closed. You don't want to open the position wide open for your opponent if he's the one on the attacking side. Takes. And then the completely thematic blow. We looked at this move when we looked at Nimzovich-Tarash. Bishop takes h7. There's actually a more accurate move. Knight d4, it turns out, is better in this specific position. I think bishop takes h7 is more thematic. And this is the move that you want to be looking at when you have a position like this, because it's sort of the heart and the soul of the attacking ideas here. But knight d4 in this specific position is actually stronger than knight f5. Moving a knight to f5 or f4 is actually something Kasparov is known for. When you look at his great attacking wins from the 80s and 90s, it often involves a light knight landing on f5, or if he's playing black on f4. And here it's completely decisive. White has unstoppable threats. Queen d4 by itself is virtually decisive. But bishop takes h7. I don't want to quibble too much because this still wins, and it's more thematic to the position. Of course, the point of this video series is to learn and help people improve, so a move like bishop takes h7 is more of what you need to be looking for in this position, because it's so often the tactical theme that's going to exist here. Rook takes. So here, it didn't even cost white material. Now this is even material. White hasn't needed to invest anything for this decisive main attack that he has. Then bishop takes g7 again. This is completely thematic to the position. This is the sort of move you want to be looking for. In this particular position, rook h5 is more accurate. One potential line. Knight e5. This blocks the long diagonal. If white plays queen h4 immediately, g6 just barely holds on. So knight e5 first. c1. And white's just completely winning. So rook h5 is more precise, but bishop xg7 is the sort of move that's more often going to exist in this sort of position. This is the thematic choice, this double bishop sacrifice. This is the theme that we saw in Nimzovich-Tarash. This is the sort of move you want to be looking for. So bishop xg7, completely thematic and still winning. Knight e5, so just making way for the queen to dive in. Queen f5. With Kasparov's greatest attacking victories, it's amazing to look at how when he makes a material investment, oftentimes it's just going to be some quiet moves that completely tie down Black's position. So here, just that little nudge. Black is completely paralyzed here. Notice how Black's material advantage doesn't actually make itself felt here. Look at this knight on a5. When the position was closed up, this knight on a5 was perfectly fine, because there wasn't this tempo play occurring where this knight immediately needed to be somewhere else. But because this knight's stuck in a5, white has a localized superiority of material on the black king side, and the black king side is the only play that matters. Black's pieces just don't have the time to get over to the king side. Knight d7 check. So this basically equalizes material. Black is holding on, but white has a continuing mating attack, plus this pass h-pawn is sort of a break in case of emergency. If for some reason something gets weird, white can always just push that down the board. This is completely winning for white. Queen c5, queen e5, this is more accurate. This forces white to keep playing. This is still a decisive advantage for white, but black can continue the game. Queen c5 just collapses. 7. Rook d3. So white just finishes mobilization up. He's just going to play rook e1, check with the queen, and just continue the mating attack. fd1. And then the dance of the queen begins. Portisch resigned here. The cutest mating line would be rook d4. And that is the end with the mate in 1. So a beautiful fireworks display from Kasparov. I sort of glossed over the tactics at the end because, this is just a decisive position for whites. And really it has nothing else to do with the hanging pawn position we were looking at. Again, the key to the position, really the first key position was bishop b2 here. This really makes a hanging pawn position attractive for white. When you're playing with hanging pawns, having the bishops lined up behind the hanging pawns like this is very attractive. Having both of those major diagonals manned by bishops that are just raking down to the king side is incredibly attractive. Get that bishop set up whenever you can if you're looking for aggressive play. And then c4. This commits to the hanging pawns, and it's a very attractive hanging pawn position for white. Everything is placed optimally for white. There are no white pieces that we wish were somewhere else. They're all just perfectly placed for the attack. When you're playing with hanging pawns, this is exactly what you want to get, this sort of aggressive position. When you're playing against, you want to try to keep the position as closed as possible. And Portisch's downfall is that he immediately violates that. He's doing Kasparov's work for him. That's exactly what you want to see when you have hanging pawns and you have pieces set up like this. And then the key move is just this d5 move. This is the key pawn break. This is the pawn break you always want to be looking at when you have hanging pawns. That should be the very first thing you analyze whenever you have hanging pawns, especially with bishops and rooks and queens and knights set up exactly like that. Your pieces are optimally placed. When you have pieces set up like this, that d5 break needs to be the very first thing you look at, because so often that's going to be the pawn sacrifice or just a line opening operation that unleashes the activity of your pieces. And here it's just completely decisive. As I said, white doesn't even need to invest material. This is even material, and this is just a completely decisive attack. But the double bishop sacrifice is the prettiest, and it is the most thematic for these hanging pawn positions. So, very thematic game, very beautiful. We're going to continue our examination next time with another beautiful attacking section. This is the fun part because playing with hanging pawns, there's a lot of fireworks and sacrifices. I promise it'll get more boring once we look at how to fight against the hanging pawns. So, my name is John. I'll see you then.